The young sergeant laughed out loud when he saw the old man standing at the armory gate. "Sir, this is a restricted area. The VA hospital is 3 miles east." The veteran didn't move. He just stared past the sergeant at the pile of rifles being loaded onto a flatbed truck. Rust covered the barrels. Wooden stock showed cracks and weathering from decades of storage. "Those M40s, the old man said quietly. "Where are they going?" The sergeant barely glanced back. "Scrap heap, they're ancient. We've got new systems now. These relics are just taking up space." The veteran's jaw tightened. "Those relics saved more lives than you'll ever know." The sergeant smirked. "Okay, Grandpa, time to move along. If you believe experience deserves respect, comment the word precision below before we continue." Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold Whitmore had retired from the Marine Corps 17 years earlier. At 73 years old, he lived alone in a small house just outside Camp Lejeune, the same base where he had spent the most significant years of his career. His neighbours knew him as a quiet man who kept his lawn immaculate and waved politely but never stopped to chat. They didn't know about the medals in his closet. They didn't know about the missions that remained classified to this day. They didn't know that Harold Whitmore had once been considered the most dangerous man in any room he entered, capable of eliminating targets from distances that modern shooters still studied in awe. His hands, now weathered and marked with age spots, had once been steadier than surgical instruments. His eyes, now requiring reading glasses, had once been capable of detecting movement at ranges that seemed impossible, but time had taken its toll, as it does with all men. Harold walked with a slight limp from an injury sustained in a conflict that officially never happened. He rose each morning at 0500 because decades of discipline had made sleep past dawn feel like failure. The base armory had been conducting an inventory reduction for weeks. New weapon systems had arrived, sleek and expensive, bristling with rails and optics and technology that would have seemed like science fiction during Harold's active years. The old M40A1 sniper rifles, the workhorses that had served Marine Scout snipers for generations, had been deemed obsolete. Storage space was limited. Maintenance costs were scrutinized. A decision had been made at some administrative level to dispose of the aging inventory. 47 rifles were tagged for destruction. Harold had learned about it from a young corporal at the hardware store who recognized his Marine Corps cap and mentioned it in passing. The corporal thought nothing of it. Old equipment got replaced all the time, but Harold felt something cold settle in his chest. Those weren't just rifles. They were instruments of precision. They were the tools that had allowed men like him to protect their brothers from impossible distances. They were history, forged in steel and walnut, and they deserved better than a smelting furnace. Harold returned to the armory gate the following morning, this time with documentation. He carried his retired military identification, his DD-214, and a letter he had written to the base commander requesting permission to inspect the condemned weapons. The sergeant from the previous day was not present, replaced by a lance corporal who seemed uncertain how to handle the situation. The paperwork was technically in order. The base commander, Colonel Marcus Reeves, was a name Harold didn't recognize. Probably too young, probably never served in combat. The lance corporal made phone calls while Harold waited in the morning heat. Eventually, a gunnery sergeant appeared. A thick-necked man with skeptical eyes who introduced himself as Gunnery Sergeant Torres. "You want to look at the scrap rifles?" Torres asked, making no effort to hide his confusion. "Why?" Harold met his gaze without blinking. "Because someone should." Torres studied the old man for a long moment. Something in those steady eyes must have registered, because Torres finally shrugged and led Harold inside the armory compound. The rifles were stacked in wooden crates, some open, revealing the weapons inside. Harold approached slowly, his heart heavy. He reached into the nearest crate and lifted one of the M40. The rust was superficial, mostly on the barrel exterior where moisture had accumulated during improper storage. The action was stiff but not frozen. The stock showed wear but no structural damage. Harold worked the bolt with practiced hands, feeling the mechanism resist and then yield. Decades of muscle memory returned. He shouldered the weapon, his cheek finding the stock naturally, his eye aligning with the scope mount even though no glass was present. Torres watched with growing interest. "You know these weapons?" he said. It wasn't a question. Harold lowered the rifle. "I know these weapons better than I know my own reflection. I carried one of these for 11 years across 4 continents. Whoever decided these were scrap metal made that decision from behind a desk, not behind a scope." Torres shifted uncomfortably. "Command says they're beyond economical repair. New systems are more accurate, more reliable, easier to maintain. Harold almost smiled. More accurate. Tell me, Gunnery Sergeant, what's the longest confirmed shot with your new systems? Torres hesitated. I'm not sure off the top of my head. Harold set the rifle down carefully. These old relics hold records that still stand, and they'll keep standing. Word spread through the armory that some old veteran was examining the condemned rifles. Marines drifted over during breaks, curious about the spectacle. Most saw an elderly man with weathered hands and outdated opinions, someone clinging to nostalgia while the modern military moved forward. A few of the younger scouts made jokes they thought Harold couldn't hear. Comments about fossils and museums, comments about wasting everyone's time. Harold ignored them. He had heard worse from better men. He worked methodically through the crates, separating weapons into groups based on his assessment. Some were genuinely beyond saving, their receivers cracked or their barrels warped. But most were sound. They needed cleaning, lubrication, and attention. They needed someone who understood them. By midday, Harold had identified 31 rifles that he believed could be restored to full operational status. Gunnery Sergeant Torres had been watching throughout, occasionally asking questions that Harold answered with patient precision. Torres was beginning to understand that this was not a sentimental old man playing soldier. This was something else entirely. The demonstration was Torres's idea. He had grown curious about Harold's claims and suggested they test one of the restored rifles on the base range. Command would never approve an official test, but Torres knew the range schedule and found a window in the afternoon when no training was scheduled. Harold accepted without hesitation. He selected an M40 that he had spent 3 hours cleaning and adjusting, working with borrowed tools and supplies that Torres had quietly provided. The rifle was old but sound. Harold had replaced a worn spring, cleaned decades of neglected carbon from the action, and adjusted the trigger to specifications he knew by heart. Torres provided match-grade ammunition, modern rounds that Harold examined with approval. "These will do," Harold said. The range was empty except for Torres and 2 younger Marines who had followed out of curiosity. One of them a scout sniper student who looked at the old rifle with barely concealed skepticism. Harold settled into position at the firing line with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. His body remembered every adjustment, every micro-correction, every breath pattern that preceded a perfect shot. Torres called out the range. 300 meters to start, a warm-up distance. Harold took his time. His first shot punched the center of the target with mechanical precision. The younger Marines exchanged glances. Torres called out 500 meters. Harold adjusted, breathed, and fired, center mass. The skeptical student was no longer smiling. Torres pushed it further, 700 meters. The target was a small point in the distance, visible through the rifle's scope but seeming impossibly far for a weapon that should have been scrapped. Harold felt the old calm settle over him, the absolute stillness that had once made him invisible on battlefields across the world. His heart rate slowed. His breathing became shallow and measured. He squeezed the trigger with the same gentleness he might use to touch a sleeping child's face. The shot echoed across the range. Downrange, the target registered a hit within 2 inches of center. The student's name was Lance Corporal Brennan, and he asked permission to try a shot at the same distance. Torres nodded. Brennan set up with one of the new systems, a rifle that cost 8 times what the M40 had originally, equipped with technology that Harold couldn't name. Brennan's shot landed 4 inches from center, a respectable grouping by any standard, but clearly outperformed by the old man with the old rifle. Brennan stared downrange, then at Harold, then at the M40 as if seeing it for the first time. "How?" he asked. Harold unloaded the weapon and began his post-firing routine. "The rifle doesn't make the shooter makes the rifle. You train with your weapon until it becomes part of your body. You learn its voice. You understand its personality. These old girls have personality. Your new systems are precise but sterile. They'll hit what you point them at. But they won't teach you anything about patience, about connection, about becoming one with your instrument." He paused and looked at Brennan with eyes that had seen more than the young man could imagine. "You're chasing technology. You should be chasing mastery." Colonel Marcus Reeves arrived at the range 30 minutes later. Someone had reported the unauthorized activity, and the base commander had come personally to investigate. He was a trim man in his late 40s, with an expression that suggested he had little patience for irregularities. Torres stood at attention, prepared to accept consequences. But Reeves was not looking at Torres. He was looking at Harold Whitmore, and his expression was changing. The colonel approached slowly, his eyes moving from Harold's face to the M40 still resting on the firing bench. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Whitmore," Reeves said quietly. Harold turned. He didn't recognize the colonel's face, but something in the way Reeves spoke his name suggested history. "You don't remember me," Reeves continued. "I was a second lieutenant in 03. You ran a training course I attended, Scout Sniper Orientation. You probably taught thousands of Marines. But I remember you. Everyone who went through your course remembered you." Harold studied the colonel's face, searching for the young officer buried beneath years of command. The memory surfaced slowly. "Reeves. You had trouble with wind calculations, kept overcompensating." The colonel almost smiled. "I did. You made me shoot 300 rounds in crosswind until I stopped thinking and started feeling. Best advice I ever received." The conversation that followed changed everything. Colonel Reeves listened as Harold explained the condition of the rifles and his assessment of their potential. He examined Torres's documentation of the range demonstration. He asked questions that revealed a genuine understanding of what Harold was proposing. By the end of the hour, Reeves had made a decision. The rifles would not be scrapped. Instead, they would be restored under Harold's supervision and integrated into the Scout Sniper training program as teaching instruments. New students would learn on the old systems first, developing fundamental skills before transitioning to modern technology. Harold would be offered a civilian consulting position, compensated for his expertise, and given access to the base facilities. Torres would oversee the program's logistics. The skeptical young Marines who had mocked the old man earlier now stood at respectful attention, understanding that they had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their careers. The restoration project took 14 months. Harold worked with a dedication that belied his age, training armory staff in maintenance techniques that weren't written in any manual, passed down through generations of shooters who understood their weapons at a level that transcended documentation. 31 rifles were restored to operational status. Each one was tested by Harold personally before being certified for training use. The program produced measurable results. Scout Sniper students who trained first on the M40 systems showed improved fundamentals when transitioning to modern platforms. They developed patience. They learned to read conditions without relying on electronic assistance. They became better shooters and better Marines. Harold never sought recognition for his contribution. He arrived early, worked steadily, and departed quietly. But the Marines who trained with him understood what they had been given. They understood that an old man with old rifles had taught them something that no amount of technology could replace. On the day the program was officially commissioned, Colonel Reeves presented Harold with a shadow box containing the first restored M40 and a plaque that read simply, "Precision has no expiration date." Harold accepted it with a nod and few words, the same quiet dignity he had carried his entire life. Years later, veterans of the program would tell stories about the old man who saved the rusty rifles. They would describe his steady hands and his patient instruction. They would talk about how he could diagnose a weapon's issues by sound alone, how he remembered every student's name, how he treated each rifle as if it were a living thing deserving of respect. Some would eventually learn the full scope of Harold Whitmore's career, the missions that remained classified, the shots that had changed the course of operations across the globe. But most knew him simply as the man who refused to let experience be thrown away. He passed away peacefully at 79, still living in his small house near the base. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Marines, many in dress uniforms, many with Scout Sniper insignia, all there to pay respects to someone who had taught them that the old ways still mattered. The M40 program continues to this day. Every rifle bears a small engraving on the stock, 3 words that carry the weight of everything Harold Whitmore represented: precision, patience, respect.